Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. Today, we're privileged to be joined by Professor Bernard Haykel, who is Professor of Near Eastern Studies and the Director of the Institute for the Transregional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia at Princeton University. He is undoubtedly one of the world's foremost experts on the contemporary Middle East, or as we like to say here in India, West Asia, and therefore we will be discussing the latest on the Iran war with him. Please stay tuned. This is going to be a fascinating discussion you certainly don't want to miss. Haykel, it's an absolute pleasure to have you back, and we're eagerly looking forward to your insights in this, I suppose, very trying times for the region.
It's a pleasure, Ishan, to be back, and I look forward to this conversation.
Excellent. So now we've suddenly had this very surprise offer of talks, it seems, by President Trump, offer to postpone strikes on energy infrastructure. I understand this is a very dynamic situation. The whole picture could change even by the time we're done with this conversation. But do you expect any breakthrough from these so-called talks, or I guess this looks more like a precursor to talks? And more importantly, do you think the US is looking for an off-ramp? Is that what this is?
Well, it is a very dynamic situation, and President Trump is a fairly erratic leader who can change his mind and also say things that are untrue,
Yeah,
partly as part of the negotiating tactics. I mean, what's clear about President Trump is that he has certain he is sensitive to certain issues, most importantly, the American economy, inflation, the price of gas, the stock market. And the Iranians know this. And they also know that, by blocking 20% roughly of global energy out of Hormuz, which is oil and gas, but
yeah.
also other commodities like phosphates, they have a pressure point and they can inflict damage on the global economy and they can cause economic headaches for President Trump. So I think he does want an off-ramp. He actually never wanted this to last very long. He thought it would be a kind of shock and awe campaign that would lead to an immediate capitulation of the Iranian regime,
Right.
modeled on what he feels he accomplished in Venezuela. And that didn't happen.
Yeah, that actually brings me to, I guess, the objectives around all of this. I mean, they did do this decapitation of the regime and perhaps did not get the desired results. As far as the Israelis are concerned, we're also part and parcel of this operation. Do you think the Americans and the Israelis are still on the same page? What would that dynamic look like at this point? Because talks certainly didn't seem to be anywhere on the horizon until yesterday.
Yeah. So I think that there are overlapping goals and interests between Israel and the United States. There are principally three goals. One is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and for that, they want all cessation of enrichment in Iran. This is of fissile material, nuclear material.
Yeah.
The second is they want an end to the ballistic and cruise missile program with the drones. And third, they want Iran to stop funding and arming and training and supporting non-state actors, militias like Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, and others in the region, the Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq.
Right.
And so those three goals, I think, are shared between Israel and the United States. Um, the decapitation of the system, I think they wanted the leader to be killed, and that was a joint effort. But I think the Israelis wanted regime change they wanted the regime to fall in Iran. I'm not sure the Americans wanted that. Americans, I think, share the view of the Arab Gulf countries that they don't want chaos in Iran, a civil war, a Libya-like situation, which would cause tremendous dislocation and instability in a vitally strategic region of the world with refugees and so on.
Yeah.
So I think the Israelis and the Americans are not on the same page when it comes to the fate of the regime and the fate of Iran. Israel doesn't mind if the regime falls, if a civil war ensues, if Iran becomes, splits into different
Right.
regions, a weak central government. I think the Americans, on close reflection, will realize that that's a bad thing for the United States and for its Arab allies in the region.
Regarding the first goal, do you think in some ways this has made Iran accelerating perhaps Uranian enrichment almost inevitable?
Well, what it has, I think, done is that you have a group in Iran of often referred to as hardliners. These are ideologically committed people to the ideology of the regime.
Right,
This is a regime based on the ideas and teachings of Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a cleric who basically was the leader of the 1979 revolution and established the form of government that they have, a kind of theocratic government. And
right,
those hardliners definitely, I think, now have come to the realization that I think two things. One is that that America and Israel have to suffer and feel pain for this attack in order to deter a future attack on Iran.
right.
So this is why you see this the regime has sort of consolidated and become much more aggressive in its response. It feels existentially threatened. And two, I think they feel that the only thing that will prevent in the long term an attack on Iran is acquiring a nuclear weapon. And here the analogies with North Korea. So yes, I think that the Iranians, this regime in Iran, if it survives, will seek to acquire a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and you said elsewhere earlier that you were talking about possible outcomes to all of this, and you did mention, I guess, the core of the regime hardening as
Yeah.
one possible outcome, with Mojtaba Khamenei becoming, I guess, the new supreme leader, and I guess those closing ranks around him. Do you think that is what is happening? Is that the outcome
Yeah,
that is
there's
being
no
written
doubt that the regime is hardened. Now, whether Mojtaba Khamenei is still alive or not, whether he's in charge or not,
by the
it's
end of
clear
next
that
year?
the regime, it's clear that, yeah, because it seems like he was injured in that first attack that killed his father, the previous supreme leader. I
Right,
think it's clear that this regime has hardened, has consolidated. We don't see so far splits or fractures within the cracks within the security apparatus of the regime, which is essentially the Revolutionary Guard Corps,
right.
about 180,000 men and another two, 300,000 paramilitary militias that keep the order in the cities and inside the country called the Basij. Yeah, we don't see cracks here. And we also see that initially the regime, after the killing of Khamenei, was attacking almost kind of in a random fashion everywhere simultaneously in response to this American-Israeli attack. Now we see a kind of much more rational and disciplined sort of escalation ladder that they're following in their attacks. So for instance, if you attack our electricity installations, we'll attack your desalination electricity installations. If you attack our oil installations, we'll attack your oil installations. And then also the attacks on that aimed at Israel's nuclear facility in Dimona in southern Israel, and the attack also on Jerusalem, the Aqsa Mosque. Those are very targeted attacks that
Right.
actually were aimed at showing the Israelis that the Iranian regime still has remarkable ballistic missile capabilities to inflict a lot of harm.
Where do you think the Israeli, I guess, confidence for this regime change operation, where do you think that emanates from? Because it does seem like the fact that the regime at least had 20% of the population support, that does seem to be common knowledge.
Yeah, no, and it's a regime that's fairly well entrenched in society, and most
Yeah,
importantly, as I said, they are united. The security forces are united, and also they have all the guns, and they're willing to kill their own people, as we saw
right.
in January, where they killed, up to 30 plus thousand of their own citizens who were demonstrating and against economic conditions in the country. Um, the confidence in Israel, I think, comes probably from the prime minister and some people around him who basically are telling him what he wants to hear. I know that within the Israeli security establishment, there are people, very high-ranking people and retired people,
Right.
who believe that this regime cannot be toppled and that this regime is too well entrenched to be toppled. Clearly, it seems that the Israeli leadership is not listening to them.
And now coming to, I guess, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, which has been bearing the brunt of Iran's retaliation to this operation. I would be remiss not to point out you're very familiar with the Saudi leadership, in particular the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. You've clarified that he was not for this operation, and in fact
Yeah.
argued against it vehemently, contrary to what's out there in the popular media. Could you go more into that? Where
Yeah,
did
I
that
mean
occur?
the Saudi leadership, but also the leadership throughout the Persian Gulf. I mean, throughout the countries of the Gulf,
Yeah,
the Arab countries knew that Israel was going to attack again, and that if the regime in Iran felt existentially threatened, which it does now, that the regime would lash out at them, at the Arab countries, in order to create a disruption in the global economy and to create disruptions in energy supplies. And the Iranians, by the way, had told the Gulf leadership that this is exactly what they would do.
that's
So
right. They've
there were no,
threatened to do this before, I think.
yeah, they threatened to do it before, and they threatened to close Hormuz and so on, and now they've done it. So the Gulf leadership, in particular, Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, realized that the Iranians could go sort of crazy, if you like, in their retaliation because they want to survive, would attack his vital installations. These are desalination plants, electricity plants, communication systems, oil installations, and that it's very difficult over a territory that's much larger than Western Europe, which is Saudi Arabia, to defend all these facilities and installations. I mean, there aren't enough missiles, interceptor missiles in the world to defend that territory. So he didn't want the war to happen. He was trying to mediate and try to, help convince the Americans of exactly what's happened and how bad this would be for everyone. Anyway, the Israelis went ahead and did it. I think he was not fully aware of how supportive President Trump would be of this attack and fully aligned with Israel and joining this attack. But now that it's happened and that the Iranians have attacked, they've attacked the UAE much more than Saudi Arabia,
Right.
incidentally. And they blocked Hormuz, and they've shown that Hormuz can be blocked, the strait can be blocked fairly easily and cheaply. You don't need to attack every ship. You need to, like, every once in a while, show that you can threaten a ship, and you basically prevent ships from crossing that strait, and you make insurance so expensive that no ship can go through. Now that the Iranians have done this and they've shown that they can attack, and they've shown that their battle plan was years in the making. I mean, these attacks on Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not just
Random. Yeah.
the result of last minute kind of decisions. These are, pre-planned war measures that the Iranians have been preparing. I think that the Gulf leadership feels now that it's impossible to live next door to this regime. This is a regime that's arsonist, a pyromaniac, willing to burn everything, and also willing to extort constantly if it doesn't get its way by either attacking ships or blocking the strait. And it's not a responsible actor, and will prevent them from getting on with the business of diversifying their economies and building out new sectors of their economies. I mean, think about it. How secure are people going to feel in Dubai going forward if this regime keeps firing a rocket every once in
Right.
a while at a skyscraper? It's an untenable and impossible situation to be in. As a result, I think some Arab countries, some of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, have decided that, this cannot stand and this regime has to be weakened much more, if not removed. And others feel, and I think that's probably the position of the UAE.
Right.
It's somewhat the position of Saudi Arabia, but you have other countries like Kuwait and Qatar, and outside the Gulf, Turkey, who want this war to end immediately. In the case of Qatar and Kuwait, it's because they can't export a single drop of their hydrocarbons because of this war. So they're really stuck. Whereas Saudi has an east-west pipeline, it can export, between 5 and 7 million barrels, 5 million barrels of crude, 2 million barrels of refined product, and the UAE can export through another pipeline that circumvents Hormuz, about 1.5 million barrels. So the UAE and Saudi are, relatively speaking, better off than the other countries. And in fact, I think if you make the calculation, the Saudis are probably making more money now exporting than they were before the war
And what
because
would
of the
you,
increase
yeah,
because of the increase in price of oil.
and what would you attribute to, I guess, the UAE's hawkishness when it comes to this situation, especially considering the fact that they faced, I guess, the brunt of the barrage.
Yeah, I think it's because of that. I think
Oh,
it's
it's
because,
because,
you know, they've had to face many more missiles than any other country, including Israel.
yeah,
And so, you know, the UAE is not going to accept to live under, you know, the sword of Damocles, which is Iran, you know, and constantly be threatened by Iran. And I think the UAE has been targeted because the Iranians, you know, are punishing the UAE for having made peace with Israel and the Abraham Accords.
right.
But also, UAE is extremely vulnerable. You know, it always presented itself as an island of stability and a place where rich people can park their money, and that's just now going up, literally going up in
In
smoke.
flames, yeah. And as far as, I guess, their collective long-term strategic calculus goes, essentially turning to the US as a provider of net security and so forth, has any of that changed by this conflict? Because they did seem quite unprepared for what came. And I understand, I mean, all the interceptors in the world are not necessarily going to stop ballistic missiles. But
Yeah.
are they disillusioned at all with the US as a result of this experience?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that the U.S. military presence in the Gulf was for a conventional type of war, a kind of land invasion,
Yeah.
like we saw in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. This is a new kind of war, which is asymmetrical, using asymmetrical kind of techniques, ballistic missiles and drones and
Drones.
cruise missiles. And, you know, so the military, the U.S. posture wasn't really geared to deal with this. And for that matter, Israel is not geared to deal with this either. So, you know, it's not like I think what will happen is that the Gulf countries will retool their militaries to be able to confront this form of warfare, which means, you know, they'll buy a lot more drones or anti-drone technologies from the Ukrainians. They might buy other systems from other countries, but the core of their military posture and the core of their security architecture is still intimately tied to the United States. Their militaries are trained by the United States. The entire culture and heavy equipment of their militaries are American. They're not going to switch away.
And do you see them? I mean, should this, I guess, attempt at dialogue not go anywhere? Do you see them going beyond this defensive posture that they've currently adopted in the war? Do you see them actively becoming full
Well, I think they
belligerents in
already
that sense
have.
as
I
well?
mean,
Yeah.
I think they already have. I mean, basically, you know, the position of the Saudis and the UAE and other Gulf countries was, you know, we're neutral. We're not going to help the Americans attack you. They cannot use our territory, our land bases. They can't use our airspace. They can't use our seas, our waters to attack Iran. That's now changed. You know, now the Americans can use their bases in the UAE, bases in Saudi to attack Iran. So that's already changed. And as to whether they will join the fight themselves with their air forces and special forces and missiles, that's you know that's an open question. Partly because it's not clear what they can offer, what value added they can provide that already isn't there with the American and Israeli forces.
Right. And it's interesting you brought up the Abraham Accords and Iran perhaps punishing the UAE for that. Does this conflict stymie, I guess, this process of normalization that Israel has been seeking amongst these countries? And with Israeli hegemony, I suppose, being a potential outcome of this conflict, should Iran get more and more diminished, how do these countries perceive that possible future?
Right. So it's too early to tell whether the Israelis will benefit, you know, in terms of
Hegemony,
normalization
yeah,
with the countries.
yeah.
I mean, I suspect that if the regime in Iran survives and remains very hostile, then it'll be very clear that these regimes need to be, at the very least, need to coordinate their security with the Israelis under the American umbrella, something called Central Command, CENTCOM.
Sanko, yeah.
Um, so, so I suspect that, you know, Iran's regime surviving will lead to greater military and security cooperation with Israel and these countries. Um, as to the question of Israeli hegemony, The Israelis are good at winning battles, but not really good at winning wars, So it's
Right.
not clear to me that Israel will be hegemonic. It's a small country relative to the other countries. And where it wants to exert its hegemony is in countries that are close to it. So Lebanon, Syria, maybe Jordan, certainly over the Palestinian territories. But
Right.
the Israelis have no ambition to control or dominate the Gulf or Saudi or the UAE or what have you. So I don't think that the Gulf countries fear Israel's military and political power um, in that respect. Turkey does. I think
Right.
one of the reasons why, for instance, Turkey wants the regime in Iran to survive is that if it doesn't survive and you have a new regime that's friendly to Israel and to the West, then the Israelis, according to the Turks, will direct their attention at Turkey, and the Turks don't want that kind of bandwidth to be
Yeah.
given to the Israelis.
Yeah, they've articulated that as well. I think Naftali Bennett was sort of quoted saying something along the lines that Turkey is the next Iran or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, and the Turks are pursuing a kind of pro-Islamist politics in Syria and Lebanon, and they have a very hostile attitude towards Israel and also towards Jews. I mean, the Turkish leadership is anti-Semitic, so they're definitely going to be targets of Israel if Israel, is able to tame and change the regime in Iran.
Right. And looking at, I guess, Iran, what's left of Iran's proxies, we have this Israeli offensive in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has apparently also been firing rockets, which is somewhat surprising. I thought they'd been highly diminished
Yeah.
before this. What do you think the end game is going to be there? And I understand Lebanon is home ground for you as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the Israelis want to basically disarm Hezbollah and destroy it. I don't know whether they're able to do that because, they signed a kind of, with the Lebanese government, they signed a ceasefire agreement well over a year ago,
Yeah,
and they continued to hit the Hezbollah targets and killing, over 500 Hezbollah commanders and fighters, and yet the Hezbollah was still able, with the help of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders who came from Iran to Lebanon, about 200 of them, to reconstitute some of their military capability, and clearly they still have missiles and drones, and they're using them. So, it's very hard to defeat Hezbollah completely if they have popular support in Lebanon, which they do among some of the Shia of the country. The others, the Sunnis and the Christians, don't like them. And the government has turned against them, but the government is limited in what it can do against Hezbollah. So, these non-state actors, they're like I don't know how quite to describe them, but they can look like they're diminishing and they're almost disappearing,
right.
but then sort of pop up almost overnight like a mushroom, and become big again. So it's very difficult to imagine the defeat of Hezbollah without the defeat of the regime in Iran.
Right. And also the Houthis and the Shia militias in Iraq, where do they stand today? What kind of threat do they pose? And have they been a party to this latest conflict or not?
Yeah, the Shia militia, the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, has been, in part, involved in this conflict. They fired missiles and drones at Americans in Iraq, and they're being attacked. I mean, there was a major attack recently against one of their commanders who was killed by the Americans, and so yes, they are involved. The Houthis, it's not clear whether they've been involved or not. I mean, there are rumors that they've launched missiles and drones at Saudi facilities, and so they're also very distant from Israel. Yes, they're a nuisance. Their main nuisance, by the way, the Houthis, is that they can try to block Bab el-Mandeb, which is the other strait that
Right.
connects, the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea. And if they do that, then you have the blockage of two straits, two of the principal straits in the world, and then they will need to be dealt with militarily, I think, as well.
And this rivalry that was playing out between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, we'd been sort of seeing it play out low key in Yemen, Sudan as well. What happens to that in the middle of all this? Will they be forced to bury the hatchet, I suppose?
Well, right now they have buried the hatchet because they're facing a similar threat from
Yeah,
Iran. I mean, there are kind of conspiracy theories that, the Saudis are quite happy to see the UAE bear the brunt of the attack because it means that, Saudi will benefit, it's more secure, it's farther away from Iran, and so on. I don't put much stock in those kinds of arguments. I think they have gotten closer because they face a common enemy in Iran, but they still have very significant differences, and some of the differences are structural, and some are policy, and some are policy related, and some are personal.
Right.
So, so the UAE and Saudi are in economic competition with each other. They're both diversifying. They're both trying to attract, AI and companies to invest in their countries. That kind of in competition is actually healthy. But they're also in competition over kind of a vision or a set of implementation of policies in the region. The UAE supports non-state actors, secessionist movements in Yemen, for instance, and in the Sudan, anyone who's against Islamism, they will back. And despite this entire war, it seems the UAE continued to supply the Rapid Support Forces. These are genocidal militias in
Yeah, the
Sudan.
Janjaweed originally. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, with weapons through Ethiopia. Um, they're also supportive of a secessionist movement in Somalia and in Somaliland. So, there are significant differences between the Saudis and the UAE. Right now, we don't hear about them because, there's a much more important and looming threat in the form of Iran.
And now, if you had to, I guess, hazard a guess about where things are going, what do you see in the future for Iran? Do you think there is a high prospect of these talks succeeding? Do you think it will not go anywhere?
It's very hard to know
Yeah,
because there are two kind of unknowns. One is the pain threshold that President Trump has.
yeah,
In other words, how desperate is he to end this war? Is he willing to continue for many more weeks or not? And it's not clear that he is.
right.
The other is the military capacity of the Iranian regime is also very opaque. I mean, we don't know whether this regime has many more missiles, how many more missiles, how many more drones.
Right,
They seem to have a huge threshold for pain,
right.
and they've built their entire kind of ideology around resistance and resilience and martyrdom, and they don't seem to care about their own people, as we saw. So the Iranians are saying, we can last this war out forever if necessary. But Iran is being systematically destroyed, and its infrastructure will keep being destroyed if it continues. And it's not clear, when they will and how they will capitulate. But sooner or later, if Trump is willing to keep going, they will have to capitulate. Um, and so, since it's not clear what these, um, you know, this capacity for staying the course and for endurance in war is on either side, the American on the one hand and the Iranian on the other, and also actually the Israeli, because the Israelis are now taking huge hits in the form of ballistic missiles.
Right.
We don't know how it's going to end. The fact that they're talking, though, is a good thing, and it shows that both sides are motivated and are feeling pain.
Yeah, and looking at things domestically within the US, where you are, it does seem, at least on the outside, that the American establishment was somewhat divided about this campaign as well. You had Joe Kent uh, resign. It seems like Vance and Marco Rubio seem to have been muted about this conflict, although Vance has been touted as a potential negotiator for these forthcoming talks. Pete Hegseth, of course, seems to be the main voice behind all of this. What does this tell you about what the appetite is for all of this within the establishment?
So, I mean, America is extremely polarized
Yeah,
politically and culturally. And so, you have the Democratic Party that hates anything Trump does.
right.
He could invent a cure for cancer tomorrow. He would still be the devil, according to them. And then you have President Trump, and he has a base called the MAGA base, the Make America Great Again base. of about 30, 33, 35% of the population. They seem to be with him. And it's really about him and not the ideology. And also, it seems like the majority of Republicans in America are still in favor of the war. That's changing. The Democrats are definitely against the war. And then you have independents, and it's not clear where the independents stand.
Right.
I think, look, if this war lasts a long time and you have body bags and Americans being killed, it'll become very, very unpopular very quickly. But if this war ends in a week and Iran is, either defeated or very seriously contained, oil prices, come back down. They're not going to go back down to 60, but they come back down, um, say to $80 a barrel. Um, and there's no inflation and things resume in the next month or two, then Trump will look like a hero, someone who was able to take on Iran, where no American president was effectively able to do so since 1979. Also, if he's able to topple the regime in Cuba, that's another notch in his belt, for a victory. So, things can turn very quickly in his favor, as they can turn very
Yeah.
negatively very quickly as well. I mean, he's taken the biggest risk and gamble of his life in this war on Iran without really thinking through, I think, the nature of the Iranian regime, that it's very different from the Venezuelan regime, that, this is a group of people who are ideologically committed and fighting for their survival, and that they can cause tremendous pain to the global economy and to the United States. So, it's not clear how things will turn out. But uh, this war has increased the polarization in the country. And also, what it has done is it has created this faction within the MAGA movement,
Right.
represented by Tucker Carlson and others, Candace Owens and so on, who feel that President Trump has betrayed his promises of not entering another Middle Eastern war, that he had campaigned against these so-called forever wars, and that he's now violated that promise. Also, this group of people in the Republican Party or in the MAGA movement, I mean, I guess
Right.
most of them are Republican, are anti-Semites.
Right.
They hate Jews and they blame Jews for all the problems of the world and of the United States,
And many conspiracy theories and
and they believe
so
in
forth.
conspiracy
Yeah.
theories, and many of them are white nationalists and fascists, sort of Nazi types. And I don't think the American people really will tolerate that kind of. I mean, the majority of American people will tolerate this kind of uh, arguments, those kinds of arguments, that kind of ideology. They're very fringe. And if the war ends well for Trump, they'll become even more fringe.
On that note, Professor Haykel, that was most insightful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.